what's transpired in Munich. And you are framing this in comparison to 1938. You're describing this as a betrayal when it comes to the US relationship with Europe and its partners here.
This is a very important signpost. I mean, Munich is a beautiful city, but it has become a byword, really, for the abandonment, in this case, of the transatlantic relationship. We've been saying to prepare for this for some time, but that nail went into the coffin this weekend.
So to be clear, because there were some views that, look, this is the US, this is the Trump administration simply trying to catalyse finally a response from Europe in terms of stepping up on defence, that relationship broadly remains intact. You pushed back against that. You make the case this relationship is now fundamentally reshaped or broken to some extent.
The hope might be for a reset, but I want to push back on this narrative that's going around the world that it's now time for Europe to step up on defense. I think that this is the Trump administration's narrative. Some European countries don't meet the NATO target, that is for sure. But this is the U.S. withdrawing from its commitments as well, right? So I really think that we should refrain from repeating those talking points. Europe needs to do more on defense than it has been. It has been slow to respond. Brussels has been talking about Trump-proofing Europe for years now, but the signal is now very apparent.
What are the vulnerabilities for Europe in this moment?
I'm going to be really clear because I want to make sure that viewers understand what has happened and what's happening next. Because the Trump administration has been very clear in what it wants to happen. There's a market narrative that says a ceasefire is called, Russian gas reserves get turned back on. That's obviously welcome to all of us who are paying higher prices for energy at home because of this. But we're talking about something else, something much more profound, which is potentially carving up the world into American, Chinese, and Russian spheres of influence.
What does China gain from this? How should we be thinking about the way that Beijing is thinking about what has transpired?
So the Russia-China friendship without limits, again, us geopolitical types have been talking about this for a long time. What was that about? Very clearly, and in their own words, it was about remaking the world and moving away from the U.S.-led, but really the U.S. and European and Japan-led post-World War II order. They are hastening that. And the consequences are unknown.
We were talking earlier in the show about German elections, and we had a J.D. Vance, a vice president, standing up in Munich, giving a tongue lashing, essentially.
Yes.
Hectoring and lecturing European leaders for essentially creating this political firewall that traditionally they've had, whether it's in France or in Germany, to keep out the far-right extremist groups, some would characterize them as. Is this a Trump administration that wants to align with the far-right in Europe?
That may be a byproduct of what's happening. But first of all, pot meet kettle on democratic norms. The U.S. has been bending democratic norms at home for some time. The firewall that Vance was complaining about, what that means is agreements between mainstream parties not to work with, in this case, extremist parties. Europe has been following this kind of protocol for some time. This doesn't sit well with America, which, of course, doesn't have a parliamentary system whereby parties work together in coalition. So, they know not of what they speak. My point is that February 23rd, elections coming soon, I've done a lot of work about how and when elections may be influenced by changes in the geopolitical context. It's still a little bit far away to understand how the AfD might perform. But one of the possible consequences, of course, is that German voters say, no thanks, Washington, interfering in our elections, and rally around mainstream parties. So, of course, there's a possibility that the AfD does better than expected. We've got a little bit of time. We've still got more than a week, I think, before we see this. But it may not be appreciated by the mainstream parties and the public
Yeah.
this kind of intervention.
Okay, Tina, we want to get your views on the Middle East, and at this point we'll bring in
The ethnic cleansing and relocation of Gaza.
the suggestion that they move
yes.
out vast numbers of the
I think it's
population
more
to
than a
neighbouring countries.
suggestion. I mean, it has been a proposal that hasn't yet been backed up with force, although force has been suggested. The fact that the neighboring countries don't want to take the Palestinians may or may not interfere with U.S. objectives. But remember that President Trump has threatened to stop the aid that goes to Egypt and Jordan, two of the largest recipients of U.S. aid. It is a question of whether, reason, as the regional governments will see it, can prevail. But the mention of even Israelis being surprised, there probably is more than one agenda going on here. One of them is the strategy toward Iran and whether attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities are what happens next. Because the Trump administration has promised all along to change the rules of the game, to avoid what it saw as the kind of toing and froing of diplomatic choreography. Why we expect the next days and weeks to follow what we're used to is surprising to me. There used to be a sign in shops that said, you break it, you buy it. We're about to see how that plays out in the Middle East and in Ukraine.
Okay, so keep an eye on Iran as well and how the Trump administration responds to the challenges there. Tina Fordham, thank you very much indeed.